They called her the most beautiful woman in the ancient world. But beauty, in Cleopatra's case, was anything but natural. Behind the silk curtains of her palace, the Queen of the Nile prepared for seduction with rituals so revolting you'd think they belonged in a torture chamber rather than a royal boudoir. From bathing in ingredients you'd never dare touch, to smearing her skin with concoctions fit for the dead. Cleopatra's methods were as shocking as they were effective, and they changed the fate of empires. She endures in our imagination as the ultimate seductress. Cleopatra, 7th, the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt, is often cast as a figure of breathtaking beauty who beguiled Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Yet modern scholarship cautions that much of that image may be propaganda. Ancient Roman writers especially, those aligned with Octavian, painted Cleopatra as a foreign temptress overshadowing Caesar's legacy and undermining Roman virtue. Plutarch, writing within a generation of her death, remarked that her beauty was in itself not altogether incomparable, but insisted it was her charisma and intellect that held others spellbound. Physical artifacts yield further ambiguity. Coins minted during her reign depict a strong-featured woman, a prominent nose, firm jawline, and thin lips, images inconsistent with later classical ideals of beauty. A marble bust in Berlin presents almond-shaped eyes and ringleted hair, features sometimes described as modest, but never conventionally beautiful in the Hollywood sense. Anthropologists have suggested she may have been short and even stout. No slender young queen from myth, but these assessments are speculative and based on known family traits in her own culture. Cleopatra shaped her identity with precision. She was born in 69 BCE into the Macedonian Greek Ptolemaic dynasty. In 51 BCE, at 18, she became joint ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. In keeping with dynastic Egyptian tradition, unlike most of her Ptolemaic predecessors, she mastered the Egyptian language in addition to Greek and was fluent in several others. Contemporary accounts credit her with writing two treatises, one on cosmetics and another on weights and measures, revealing a cultured mind equal to royal ambition. Egyptian culture placed great weight on symbolic beauty and divine association. Cleopatra styled herself in the image of Isis, the mother goddess, blending Egyptian myth with Hellenistic iconography to strengthen her claim to divine rulership. On coins and in temples, she appeared as Isis or Venus Aphrodite, reinforcing her sacred status to subjects and foreign rulers alike. The stakes of her image became deeply political when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE. At that point, Cleopatra was 21 and already driven into exile by her brothers' supporters. According to Plutarch, she arranged for herself to be smuggled into the palace, rolled inside a carpet or linen sack. Emerging before the 52-year-old Caesar in simple linen and with composed confidence, she quickly turned from fugitive to political partner. Their liaison produced a son, Caesarion, and effectively backed Cleopatra against her brother and Roman opposition. After Caesar's assassination on March 15, 44 BCE, the Roman world fractured. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and then triumvirate, soon summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BCE to address rumors she had supported his enemies. She appeared not just as a client queen, but as a performance of divine power, sailing down the river Cydnus in a gilded barge draped in purple, attended by servants burning incense, embodying Isis meeting Dionysus. Antony was captivated not simply by her, but by her stagecraft, her resources, and her state of mind. Within months, their bond deepened. Antony divorced his Roman wife Octavia in 32 BCE, alienating many in Rome, and openly sided with Cleopatra. Their partnership produced 3 children and culminated in the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, ceremonial division of territories and titles among their offspring, recognized within their eastern realms but viewed as treasonous by Octavian. In Rome, that political rupture triggered the final civil war of the Republic by 31 BCE. Octavian had declared war on Cleopatra herself, and at the Battle of Actium on September 2nd, they suffered naval defeat. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria. Within the following year, both committed suicide. Antony in early August 30th BCE, Cleopatra shortly after. Egypt was annexed, and Octavian emerged as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. These events framed the essential tension of her legacy. Was Cleopatra's power rooted in physical beauty or in intellect, performance, and political strategy? Ancient observers show conflicting views. Cassius Dio, writing around 2 centuries later, called her a woman of surpassing beauty, with a voice that could subjugate everyone. Plutarch counters that what truly fascinated men past their prime was her compelling conversation. Scholars today lean toward a synthesis. Cleopatra combined sufficient physical presence, eloquence, multilingual fluency, imperial authority, theatrical mastery, and the promise of wealth into a portrait of power few could resist. For the viewer, that sets the opening question. Was Cleopatra seductive because she looked like a goddess, or because she performed like one? Backed by political clout, ritual spectacle, and acute psychological insight. That ambiguity between myth and documented reality, between rumor and recorded fact, drives the story. And beneath it lies something deeper. Not just a queen seducing 2 of Rome's greatest leaders, but a woman reshaping the fate of nations. Through image, wit, and diplomacy. Cleopatra's most infamous beauty ritual was her milk bather, daily plunge in donkey or camel milk, sometimes left to sour. Contemporary reports claim that up to 700 donkeys were needed to supply enough milk for her full body soak, while no surviving Egyptian text confirms the queen herself bathed this way. Roman and later sources describe elite women using fermented donkey milk to preserve youth and whiten skin. In ancient belief, soured milk held a secret, as bacteria transform lactose into lactic acid. This natural alpha-hydroxy acid gently dissolves dead skin cells. The mechanism is understood even today. Acids exfoliate the outer layer, revealing smoother, brighter new skin beneath. For Cleopatra, this was more than cosmetic. Radiant, pale skin signified noble status, physical discipline, and divine favor. In the alabaster tub of her private bathing chamber in Alexandria, attendants would fill it with milk drawn fresh the morning. Over several hours, milk warmed to the Egyptian heat would begin to ferment. Servants tested its smell and texture, ensuring a faint tent signaled readiness. Cleopatra slipped in, often accompanied by honey, rose petals, or oils, additives in Egyptian baths to soften and scent the skin. The odor must have been sharp sour, slightly rancid, coated with underlying sweetness. The milk felt thicker than water, a silk-like viscosity enveloping the body. As lactic acid began mild exfoliation, skin tingled. Cleopatra remained submerged, long enough to allow absorption of fats and proteins. Donkey milk's low-fat content, with high lactose and bioactive enzymes, would cling to pores and soothe imperfections. Such a ritual carried symbolism. In Egypt, purity and rebirth were bound to water, and milk was life. Bathing in milk echoed myth. Isis nourished Horus with milk. Cleopatra styled herself as Isis incarnate. The sour element, the fermentation marked transformation, decay, yielding renewal. To Romans, pale skin denoted leisure and wealth. Donkey milk baths were an extreme expression of that ideal, reserved for the highest echelons. When the historian Pliny the Elder wrote that Papaya Sabina bathed in donkey milk 7 times daily, he implied that the practice was luxury, perhaps dangerous over time. Repeated exposure to sour milk could cause irritation. Lactic acid, particularly in high concentrations, can sting or burn raw skin. Modern cosmetic peels use far stronger acids, but even then risk redness, peeling, and discomfort. Cleopatra's skin may have become sensitive, shiny, and paler. Glow that came at sensory cost. Yet for a queen who belonged to gods in Egyptian thought, discomfort equated power. Roman sources emphasize the ritual as spectacle as much as skincare. Cleopatra's public appearances were filled with scent and color, but her daily milk bath was private, sacramental. It belonged to the woman preparing to walk between divine imagery and imperial diplomacy. Her skin, luminous and pristine, became part of her political performance. Roman envoys recorded a soft glow likened to ivory. Egyptian temple inscriptions celebrated royal patrons with alabaster features. Milk bathing bridged both worlds. Historians debate authenticity. The earliest explicit endorsement of donkey milk bathing is in Pliny, describing Papaya Sabina. Cleopatra had died some 70 years earlier. That suggests the ritual might have been retroactively attributed to the queen to enhance her legend. Modern Egyptologists note no surviving Ptolemaic medical papyri confirm the practice. Instead, it appears in later anecdotal tradition. Nevertheless, donkey milk's cosmetic virtues were real. Rich in lactic acid, it exfoliates, hydrates, and brightens. Cleopatra's regime would yield milky residue, softened skin, and a pallor unmatched by sunlit Egyptians. In Egypt's desert heat, pale skin marked tranquility, feminine control, leisure, and privilege. Reconstructing the experience, Cleopatra's chamber, high-ceilinged and tiled in blue faience, was heavy with humid steam. Slave girls poured golden honey, plucked petals from jars, and maintained temperature. As sour milk bathed her, attendants massaged the body, rinsing so excess curd did not clump. The sensory effect, goo-soft skin, faint sweetness under sour. Bite, scented faintly with rose or cedar oil. The symbolic layering went deeper. Cleopatra's bath was a private endurance of minor pain and odor for a public payoff skin like freshly scoured marble. Radiance like moonlight on the Nile. In a court steeped in ritual, her body was project and palace. The milk bath represented mastery over nature, turning decay into beauty, using humble animal product to achieve imperial aura. After the bath, she would be lightly powdered, perhaps with chalk or white marl, and perfumed heavily to counter residual smell. In Roman culture, whitening powders were essential. Cleopatra's whiteness became part of her myth and fuel for Roman envy. When Caesar or Antony saw her skin in candlelight, they saw refinement. When Roman senators heard of the ritual, they saw decadent Eastern luxury. No direct record confirms whether Cleopatra herself witnessed the souring process, but the ritual's seasoned servants would present the bath when it reached optimum acidity. Milk from camels appears in some accounts when donkey milk proved scarce but both soured similarly. Camel milk is richer and thicker, but less recorded than donkey milk in traditional cosmetics. Roman writers often portrayed exotic substances as part of Cleopatra's otherness. In political terms, the regime was never just about skin. It signaled divine maternity, eternal youth, and elite separation. Allies and subjects alike saw Cleopatra as ageless. When she arrived in time to meet Mark Antony in 41 BCE, her appearance was deliberate: skin pale as linen, hair perfumed, robe purple, an iconographic statement before any conversation began. Thus, the milk bath was a ritual of powara, scented, sour, sensory sacrifice, producing visible authority. It tied her to Egyptian myth and Greek luxury, to science and spectacle. Even the stink had purpose. In Rome, the ability to bear discomfort for beauty marked aristocratic will. Cleopatra's bath reeked of status. Ultimately, the bath that reeked of power reveals a deeper truth. Cleopatra turned ordinary bacteria, oils into political theater. She weaponized her image, merging cosmetic chemistry with psychological influence. And even today, as legends condense centuries into myth, the sour milk bath remains one of the most visceral symbols of her calculated, transformative allure. Exotic fragrance was among Cleopatra's most potent tools. In ancient Egypt, scent was charged with religious and erotic power. Royal perfumers transformed animal fat or vegetable oil into richly scented unguents and incense, mixing aromatic ingredients like myrrh, frankincense, cassia, cinnamon, and balanos. Oil the seeds of the Balanites Egyptiaca tree into long-lasting blends worn by elites. These perfumes were traded across the Mediterranean and prized in both temples and courts. One of the most renowned scents associated with Cleopatra was the Mendesian perfume, celebrated by Pliny and Dioscorides. Archaeologists have reconstructed this legendary blend using fragments recovered from the Nile Delta city of Mendezit, included myrrh, cassia, cinnamon, resin, and balanos oil. In aroma, it is described as a spicy sweet, lingering fragrance, an ancient equivalent of a modern signature scent. Another ancient Egyptian preparation was kifi, a complex incense used in temple rituals and as medicine. Ingredients numbered 10 to 16 depending on the recipe and included honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, juniper berries, turpentine, resin, cardamom, saffron, bdellium, mint, and more. Kifi wasn't applied to the body but burned to fill spaces with divine aromatic smoke. Symbolized transcendent purity. Perfume production began with a base of oils or fats. Animal fat from cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys, or waterfowl was melted gently and macerated with fragrant resins, spices, and plant extracts. The process, called enfleurage, involves soaking aromatic roots or flowers in fat or oil over heat, then skimming off the scented layer. The result was a soft pomade, shaped into cones or bowls. Temple-goers would place these on their heads to slowly melt, perfuming hair and skin. Some sources, including less well-verified traditions, suggest Cleopatra, essa personal fragrances, may have incorporated crushed beetles for vivid red pigments or added animal fat for depth, and, in a few Roman anecdotes, even insects or blood components for exotic effect. While specific recipes for Cleopatra's blends are lost, such ingredients appear in Egyptian cosmetic palettes, and the use of beetle powder as a red pigment is documented for lip and cheek stains. Though unsubstantiated in royal texts, these accounts underscore Egypt's embrace of extreme sensory materials. The fragrance ritual was precise and sensory, Artisans heated Balanos oil to absorb resin volatiles like myrrh or cassia resin. They stirred mixtures until fully blended, then baked or boiled slowly. The finished product was poured into alabaster jars, light-sealed to preserve scent. These beautiful containers were symbols of status, often inscribed or shaped like lotus buds or goddesses. Perfume makers kept meticulous recipes, sometimes inscribed on temple walls at Edfu and Phale during the Ptolemaic period. In political and erotic contexts, scents served a calculated purpose. Historical accounts describe Cleopatra's entrance to Mark Antony in Tarsus in 41 BCE. Her royal barge supposedly had sails, drenched in scented oils, lifting in the breeze to fill the air with fragrance before she stepped ashore. That olfactory impact was part show, part psychological tactic. Scent preceded her presence and lingered after she departed. Close quarters. Seduction relied on fragrance. In private audiences, men encountered not only Cleopatra's voice and costume, but also the aroma clinging to her skin and clothes. In a culture where smell was associated with divine favor, the senses could be overwhelmed. To smell her was to sense power, wealth, and ritual purity. Many classical authors tied scent to erotic influence, claiming Cleopatra's perfumes could entrance Caesar and Antony as surely as her. Conversation. The symbolic dimension of scent was deeply rooted in Egyptian religion. Fragrance linked the living queen to divine figures. Isis was often offered unguents and incense in temples. Ceremonial scent represented spiritual transformation. Cleopatra styled herself as Isis incarnate, merging ritual, myth, and politics. The fragrances she wore, myrrh, frankincense, cassia, were not random aromatics, but ingredients associated with divine rituals. In daily life, royal perfumers labored in Alexandria or the Delta. Workshops discovered at Thuiwi near Mendes and temple labs had domed kilns, clay vessels, and evidence of large-scale productions suggesting perfumes were made not only for the royal court, but for export. Ceramic jars found at Thuiwi bear residue consistent with scented fats and resins. And archaeologists believe artisans crafted these blends for elite clients across the Mediterranean, reinforcing Cleopatra's economic and sensory reach. The sensory horrify. One perceives it was part of the drama. Animal fats warmed, spices simmered, and resins hissed. The air in workshops would have smelled pungent, an earthy sweetness, a resinous bitterness, sharpened by spices. Preparing those scents required heat, slow heating, distillation, or maceration. Wearing them meant enveloping the body in layers of scent, some strong enough to elicit discomfort in unaccustomed noses. Yet that mixture signaled authority, exoticism, dominance. The fragrance was intimately tied to Cleopatra's seduction strategy. Julius Caesar met her amid a scented boudoir. Mark Antony first met her beneath sails, incense, perfumes. Her scents created an environment, her body became a temple, her perfume a divine aura. As Roman observers later fanned rumor, they emphasized the otherworldliness of her aroma, sometimes even claiming the smell was intoxicating enough to overshadow political caution. Every element, animal fat, resin, beetle pigment, burnt incensoires, manipulated to produce control. The sealing of perfumes in elegant jars preserved scent. Its release was timed for entrances or political gatherings. When ambassadors came to Alexandria, nobles offered them tiny alabaster containers filled with Mendesian perfume, a symbol of favor and diplomacy. The fragrance declared Egypt's sophistication and Cleopatra's dominion over luxury trade. Today, scientists who recreated Mendesian fragrance describe it as strong, spicy, balsamic, sophisticated, the kind of scent that lingers on skin and memory. For Cleopatra, perfume was not mere adornment, it was a ritualized weapon. In an age without amplification, her scent permeated rooms, shaped perceptions, and reinforced her image not just as queen but as goddess. Perfume of the dead, the aroma, connected Cleopatra to Egyptian funerary traditions too. Myrrh and incense formed central elements of embalming rituals, crossing thresholds between life and afterlife. By wearing such scents, Cleopatra fused living presence with mortal transcendence. Her perfume was at once seductive, spiritual, political, a sensory declaration of power that outlasted spoken word. Thus, the perfumes Cleopatra employed were not trivial cosmetics, but components of theatre, diplomacy, and seduction. Animal fat, resins, spices, and pigments formed rituals as potent as her words. The fragrance enveloped her image and infected antiquity's imagination. And centuries later, that aromatic legacy continues to define her mystery perfume as seduction, power, and divine allure. In Cleopatra's Egypt, cosmetics were more than decoration. They were statements of identity, markers of divine association, and, at times, tools with hidden danger. Among the most striking elements of her appearance was the vivid coloring of her lips and cheeks, the bold red that carried cultural and symbolic weight. This pigment was not drawn from harmless flowers or fruit alone. Historical evidence points to the use of substances that, in the modern world, would be classed as toxic. One of the most prominent of these was cinnabar, the naturally occurring mineral form of mercury sulfide. The Egyptians had used it for centuries to produce a deep red pigment. Ground to a fine powder, it provided the kind of rich color that signaled vitality, health, and high status. In Cleopatra's time, red lips and flushed cheeks were associated, not only with beauty but with the vitality of the gods themselves. In religious art, deities and royalty were often depicted with red-tinted skin, a visual link between divine power and earthly rule. Cinnabar was mined in various parts of the ancient world, including Spain's Almadón mines, and traded across the Mediterranean. In Egypt, it was imported and refined for use in art, temple murals, and, for the wealthy, in cosmetics. But the mineral was far from safe. Modern science has confirmed that prolonged skin contact or inhalation of cinnabar dust exposes the body to mercury, a heavy metal that accumulates in tissues and causes long-term neurological damage. In small doses, it can irritate the skin and cause inflammation. Over time, it can impair coordination, damage organs, and affect mood and cognition. Ancient users could not have known the precise medical mechanics of mercury toxicity, but they were aware that certain pigments and preparations were strong or dangerous. In some cultures, the lasting quality of cinnabar, the fact that its color did not easily fade, was linked to its supposed potency. The risk was outweighed, in elite circles, by the prestige it conveyed. Cleopatra, ruling in a world where image was inseparable from authority, would have understood the value of such enduring color in her public appearances. Egyptian cosmetic traditions also included other potentially hazardous ingredients. Red ochre, less toxic than cinnabar but still a mineral-based pigment, was sometimes mixed with fat or gum for application to the skin. Some recipes combine red ochre with lead-based compounds, which, like mercury, posed health risks. There is evidence from surviving cosmetic palettes and residue analyses that high-status women had access to complex pigment blends, often incorporating imported materials. The expense and rarity of these ingredients added to their allure. Concept of the poisonous kiss emerges from this intersection of beauty and danger. Cleopatra's lips, painted with a pigment that carried the essence of distant lands and the weight of exotic trade, were also coated in a substance that could, over time, cause harm. In an era without modern medical knowledge, any long-term effects, tremors, mood swings, fatigue would have been attributed to other causes, perhaps even seen as signs of divine possession or the burdens of rulership. Some historians and classicists have speculated on whether Cleopatra might have been aware of the more immediate effects certain substances could have. While mercury poisoning is cumulative, strong pigments and plant-based stains could cause subtle physical reactions, mild tingling, increased blood flow to the skin that heightened the sense of vitality. In a culture where rulers consciously manipulated every aspect of their appearance, it is plausible she valued not only the color but the sensory impression such pigments created. There is also the possibility that the element of danger added to her mystique. Roman propaganda often depicted Cleopatra as a figure who blurred the line between seduction and peril. The notion that her cosmetics contained potent, even dangerous substances would have aligned with that image, a queen whose very touch or kiss could be as intoxicating as it was threatening. This idea fed into the broader Roman portrayal of her as both enchantress and threat to the moral order of the Republic. Beyond cinnabar, Cleopatra's court likely experimented with plant-based dyes such as alkanet root, henna, and carmine from cochineal insects, though the latter was more common in later periods and in other regions. Alkanet root produced a deep purplish-red stain, while henna gave an orange-red hue. These were safer than mercury-based pigments, but less enduring and vivid, which may explain why mineral pigments remained in use among the elite despite their risks. The preparation of these cosmetics was a skilled process. Pigments were ground on stone pallets with water or oil, then mixed with binders like animal fat, beeswax, or gum arabic to create a smooth paste. The result could be applied with a small brush or fingertip. In public ceremonies, theatrical lighting from torches and oil lamps would have made the rich reds of cinnabar pigments stand out, enhancing facial expressions and drawing attention to the mouth, a focal point for both speech and allure. The political value of this was significant. Cleopatra operated in a diplomatic theater where appearances carried strategic weight. When she met foreign envoys, dined with Roman generals, or appeared before her subjects, her image was an instrument of persuasion. A face framed in dramatic eyeliner, with cheeks and lips painted in vivid, unyielding red, projected health, energy, and dominance. It was not the look of a passive monarch, but of an active, commanding ruler. Over time, repeated exposure to toxic pigments might have contributed to health issues. While no ancient source directly connects Cleopatra's death or any specific illness to mercury or lead exposure, modern scholars have noted that the cumulative effect of these cosmetics on the elite, who wore them daily, would have been significant. The same could be said of her contemporaries across the ancient Mediterranean, from Roman matrons to Persian nobles, who also used mineral-based cosmetics. Whether Cleopatra knowingly embraced the risks for their aesthetic and symbolic power, or whether she simply followed established traditions without full understanding of their dangers, remains uncertain. What is clear is that in her world, beauty and power were intertwined, and both could be sharpened by the edge of danger. The pigments on her lips were part of a broader arsenal alongside scent, jewelry, clothing, and ceremonial displayed that she wielded to control perception in the public imagination. The image of Cleopatra's red-painted lips endures as more than an aesthetic detail. They represent the calculated use of every available means, natural or hazardous, to project an image that could not be ignored. In the courts of Alexandria and Rome, the poisonous kiss was less a literal weapon than a symbol of her ability to blend allure with authority, risk with reward. And for those who faced her, the memory of that vivid red would linger long after the audience ended. In Cleopatra's Egypt, beauty was inseparable from ritual, and ritual was inseparable from power. Among the most startling cosmetic practices recorded in fragments of ancient accounts is the use of animal blood and ground liver as treatments for the skin. Though modern audiences might recoil, in the ancient world these substances carried both practical and symbolic weight, rooted in centuries of Egyptian belief and reinforced by the queen's mastery of presentation. Animal blood was valued not only for its physical properties, but for what it represented. In Egyptian religious and magical thought, blood was the carrier of Ka, vital force, the essence of life. Myths surrounding Isis and Osiris described how life could be restored through divine intervention, with blood often symbolically linked to resurrection and renewal. By physically applying blood to the body, one was, in symbolic terms, covering oneself in vitality itself. This association was not confined to mythology. In temple rituals, red pigments and dyes sometimes derived from ochre, sometimes from organic matter, were used to anoint statues of gods and the skin of priests during festivals. The color red in Egyptian iconography represented both life and protection. It was connected to the power of the sun god Ra, the heat of vitality, and even the fierce protective force of the goddess Sekhmet. Red could also signify regeneration, which made it a fitting hue for any ruler wishing to project health and divine favor. The cosmetic use of animal blood likely served a dual purpose. On a purely practical level, freshly drawn blood contains proteins, iron, and other compounds that, when applied to the skin, could create a temporary flush and sheen. Ground liver, rich in vitamin A and other nutrients, was also valued in ancient medicine for its restorative qualities. Mixed together and sometimes blended with honey, oils, or herbal infusions, these ingredients formed a paste or mask. Applied to the face, they produced a reddish tone that could mimic the vigor of youth, a quality highly prized in royal imagery. For Cleopatra, whose reign from 51 to 30 BCE was as much a performance as a political office, such preparations may have been used before moments of high significance, with foreign envoys, public festivals, or private meetings with powerful allies. In a political landscape dominated by visual impact, a ruler's appearance could influence perception before a single word was spoken. A face flushed with a healthy red hue was more than a sign of beauty. It was a statement of vitality, dominance, and divine connection. The process of preparing these masks was labor-intensive. Servants or court cosmeticians would first obtain the animal blood, often from freshly slaughtered livestock, kept within palace precincts, or acquired from temple sacrifices. The liver, prized for its nutrient density, was cleaned, dried partially in the sun, and then ground on a stone slab into a fine pulp. The two ingredients were then combined in proportions adjusted to the desired intensity of color. Some mixtures incorporated powdered minerals, red ochre for a deeper pigment, or malachite for an iridescent tint and binding. Agents such as beeswax or gum arabic to improve adherence to the skin. Applied in a thin layer, the mask would dry to a firm, slightly glossy surface, temporarily tightening the skin and leaving a faint stain when removed. In the heat of Alexandria, such treatments could not be worn for extended periods without spoiling, so they were often applied shortly before an appearance. Contemporary knowledge of hygiene was limited, and while some herbal additives had antibacterial properties, the risks of infection or irritation were likely accepted as part of the process, much as toxic mineral pigments were accepted for their visual benefits despite long-term dangers. The visual effect of these masks resonated with established artistic conventions. In Egyptian wall paintings and sculpture, elite men and women were often depicted with reddish-brown skin tones, a convention rooted in symbolic gender distinctions, but also in the idea of physical vigor. For a queen, adopting this tone could subtly align her with both male vitality and divine energy, presenting her as a ruler whose power transcended traditional boundaries. Beyond Egypt, in the broader Hellenistic world, rosy skin was a beauty ideal associated with good health and noble birth. Greek and Roman authors frequently commented on complexion as an indicator of social class. Those who worked outdoors were tanned and weathered, while the elite, shielded from harsh labor, displayed lighter skin with a natural or enhanced blush. Cleopatra, positioned between Egyptian tradition and Greco-Roman taste, could adapt her appearance to appeal to both sets of cultural expectations. It is unclear how widely the use of blood-based cosmetics was practiced among Egyptian elites, but ritual applications of blood in religious and magical contexts are well documented. Texts from the medical papyri of the New Kingdom, still copied in later periods, describe remedies and spells involving blood from various animals, each chosen for its symbolic or supposed medicinal qualities. Such practices persisted into the Ptolemaic era, when Greek and Egyptian traditions intermingled in the royal court. If Cleopatra employed these treatments, the act would have been more than personal grooming. It would have been a ritual of transformation. In the private chambers of the palace, surrounded by trusted attendants, she could prepare her appearance in a way that merged health, beauty, and sacred symbolism. By the time she stepped into public view, her skin would carry the visual language of vitality and divine sanction, subtly reinforcing her authority. This deliberate control of image was crucial in her dealings with Rome, when Julius Caesar visited Alexandria, and later when Mark Antony summoned her to Tarsus. Cleopatra's presentation was carefully constructed to project more than attractiveness. Every element, garments, jewels, scents, and even the hue of her skin, worked together to create an impression of a ruler whose power was both human and otherworldly. The possible use of blood-based treatments fit within this broader strategy of sensory impact. From a modern perspective, such practices may seem extreme, even macabre. Yet in the ancient mindset, the boundary between the physical and the symbolic was porous. To wear the essence of life on the skin was to cloak oneself in a force that was both visible and metaphysical. The queen's subjects, steeped in these beliefs, would have read the visual cues instinctively, understanding the red glow not just as a sign of beauty, but as a signal of divine favor and the ability to renew and sustain life, a desirable quality in any monarch. The cultural weight of this symbolism cannot be overstated. In an age when the appearance of vigor could sway politics, when rulers were seen as semi-divine, and when ritual permeated daily life, A cosmetic treatment, like a blood mask, was more than vanity. It was a political act, a silent proclamation, that the queen embodied the vitality of the state itself. Cleopatra's mastery of such imagery helped her maintain influence in a perilous political climate, where Egypt's independence depended on her ability to command respect and fascination from both her own people and the power brokers of Rome. Whether in the gilded halls of Alexandria or the tense atmosphere of diplomatic encounters, the blood on the skin was another instrument in her repertoire of visible, visceral reminder that her beauty was inseparable from her power, and that both were sustained by rituals as old as the Nile itself. In Cleopatra's Egypt, the eyes were more than a feature of beauty. They were a canvas for power, a mirror of divine identity, and a shield against both human and supernatural threats. Few images are more enduring than the heavily lined eyes of Egyptian royalty extended with black kohl into the shape of the Horus falcon, edged in sharp angles that spoke of command and mystery. For the Ptolemaic queen, eyeliner was not simply cosmetic, it was a direct link to over 2,000 years of Egyptian tradition. Kohl, known in ancient Egyptian as mestamet, was used daily by men, women, and children alike. Its practical uses were understood even in antiquity. The harsh sun of the Nile Valley could burn unprotected eyes, and the reflection of light off the river and desert sands caused strain. Kohl reduced glare, acting much like a primitive form of sunglasses. But its significance went far beyond protection from sunlight. The Egyptians believed that painting the eyes was a form of protective magic. The outline mirrored the shape of the wadjet, also called the Eye of Horus, symbol of healing, divine power, and warding off evil. By encircling the eyes with this sacred shape, a person invoked the god's protection against illness, curses, and the evil eye, a belief shared by cultures across the ancient Mediterranean. Cleopatra's kohl was made from ingredients that, to modern minds, sound both exotic and hazardous. One of the most common components was galena, a naturally occurring lead sulfide mineral ground into a fine powder. When mixed with water or animal fat, it formed a thick, black paste that could be applied with a slender stick of wood, ivory, or metal. This paste adhered well to the skin and resisted smudging in the intense Egyptian heat. Historical and archaeological evidence also points to the inclusion of other materials in more elaborate formulations. Malachite, a green copper carbonate mineral, was sometimes used to create a green eye paint for ceremonial occasions. In some instances, the black pigment was deepened with the addition of soot, charred herbs, and even powdered beetle shells. Certain beetles, when burned or crushed, yielded dark, shimmering particles that gave eyeliner a lustrous quality. Applying kohl was a deliberate ritual. The face would be cleaned, and the pigment mixed freshly or scraped from stored cosmetic containers made of stone, ivory, or faience. The applicator's stick would be dipped into the paste, then drawn carefully along the lash line and extended outward into a long, elegant tail toward the temple. Both upper and lower lids were outlined, creating the elongated almond-shaped eyes, now synonymous with Egyptian art. To Cleopatra, the effect was transformative. In the dim light of oil lamps or the flicker of torches during court audiences, the eyes became focal points, drawing attention and holding it. For a ruler whose authority depended on commanding the gaze of others, this was an asset beyond simple ornamentation. Roman authors who saw her describe not only her voice and intellect, but the force of her presence. much of which was shaped by the deliberate construction of her image. The link between coal and status was as much political as it was aesthetic. Elaborate, well-applied eyeliner indicated access to luxury goods and the time to apply them with care, both marks of elite status. While common Egyptians also used coal for its protective benefits, the precision and richness of the royal application set the queen apart. Cleopatra's coal would have been made from the finest galena, imported when necessary, and blended with rare additives. The intensity of the black line and the symmetry of its form were visual markers of discipline, wealth, and cultural authority. Yet the very ingredients that gave coal its potency carried risks. Galena contains lead, and prolonged exposure to lead compounds is toxic. Absorption through the skin or accidental ingestion over years of daily use could result in lead poisoning, with symptoms ranging from fatigue and irritability to neurological damage. But in a paradox that seems almost deliberate, recent chemical studies of ancient coal residues have revealed that trace amounts of lead salts in the mixture may have stimulated the production of nitric oxide in the skin. This compound can help the body fight bacterial infections, including those common in the Nile's marshy environment. The irritation some experienced from coal application may have been seen as proof that it was working, keeping the eyes healthy and the vision sharp. This belief that a slight sting or watering of the eyes made them cleaner, brighter, and more beautiful was not unique to Egypt. Across ancient cultures, cosmetics and treatments that caused mild discomfort were often thought to be more effective. Cleopatra, like others of her time, may have valued that sensation as a sign of both purification and enhancement. The cultural symbolism layered on top of these practical and pseudo-medical benefits gave coal an even greater role in Cleopatra's repertoire of self-presentation. The heavily lined eye, framed by dark, dramatic curves, echoed depictions of goddesses such as Hathor, associated with love, beauty, and fertility, and Isis, the divine mother and protector. In aligning her own image with these figures, Cleopatra reinforced her claim to semi-divine status, a powerful message in both domestic and diplomatic contexts. When she appeared before Julius Caesar in Alexandria, or later before Mark Antony in Tyre, the careful framing of her eyes would have been as deliberate as the choice of her robes, jewelry, and perfumes. In Roman culture, eye contact was a form of social dominance. To hold someone's gaze was to assert control. Cleopatra's eye makeup did not merely accentuate her gaze, it weaponized it, making it more difficult to look away. The Romans themselves admired and adopted aspects of Egyptian cosmetic traditions, though they were often quick to portray them as decadent or excessive in political propaganda. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Octavian's regime painted her as a symbol of Eastern luxury corrupting Roman virtue, and the coal-lined eyes became part of that imagery, a shorthand for seduction, mystery, and dangerous allure. Yet the persistence of eyeliner in Roman fashion, especially among the wealthy, suggests that fascination overcame moral disapproval in her own time. Cleopatra's mastery of cosmetic arts was not vanity, it was governance. Every public appearance was an act of statecraft, and the eyes were the most direct channel for influence. The black lines that extended from their corners were not arbitrary flourishes, but part of a visual language her subjects and rivals understood. Instinctively, this was a ruler with divine protection, with the favor of the gods, and with the power to see and be seen in ways that transcended the ordinary. Even centuries later, the image endures. The artifacts left behind, cosmetic pots inscribed with royal names, Applicator sticks worn smooth from use, fragments of mineral pigment speak to a daily practice that was as ritualized as it was aesthetic. They remind us that in Cleopatra's Egypt, beauty and power were inseparable, and that something as small as a line of black pigment could carry the weight of empire. For Cleopatra, the eyes were the axis of her public persona. Beetles, ash, galenothes were not mere ingredients, but tools of transformation. Through them, she became not only queen, but goddess, not only a political figure, but a living emblem of Egypt's sacred and unbroken tradition. In the shadowed corridors of her palace and under the glaring sun of the Nile, her eyes framed in black watched, commanded, and endured. Cleopatra's court was famous for its pageantry, but the most potent displays of her power often took place behind closed doors, in the intimate setting of a banquet. In Ptolemaic Egypt, dining was not a mere exchange of food and drink, it was theatre, diplomacy, and negotiation. For Cleopatra, meals with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony became carefully orchestrated performances, where every aroma, texture, and taste was chosen to influence the senses and tilt political advantage in her favor. Banquets in Alexandria drew upon a vast network of trade routes that brought to Egypt the rarest ingredients of the ancient world. Ships from India carried cinnamon and black pepper. Caravans from Arabia brought frankincense and myrrh. Nubia provided ivory, gold, and aromatic resins. The Aegean contributed fine wines and cheeses, and Egypt's own fertile delta yielded wheat, figs, grapes, and honey in abundance. Cleopatra's kitchens had access to delicacies from 3 continents, and she used them as tools of impression and persuasion. A defining element of her private feasts was the incorporation of foods believed to act as ancient medical texts from both the Greek and Egyptian traditions listed such foods, spices like cinnamon, cardamom, and saffron, honey, nuts, certain shellfish, and even fermented fish sauces. One of the most prized condiments of the Mediterranean was garum, a potent liquid made from fermenting fish with salt. Roman elites prized it for its sharp, savory depth, and Cleopatra's chefs likely blended it with Egyptian herbs to create complex, lingering flavors that appealed to the palates of her Roman guests. Rare fruits were another signature feature. Dates, pomegranates, and figs, all associated in ancient symbolism with fertility and abundance, were served fresh or preserved in honey. The pomegranate, in particular, had strong associations with love and desire in both Greek and Egyptian mythology. Grapes, a staple in winemaking, were offered in elaborate displays that emphasized Egypt's prosperity. By presenting such abundance, Cleopatra reminded her guests, subtly but unmistakably, that she ruled one of the richest lands in the known world. The sensory assault of these banquets began before the first bite. Perfumed oils were burned in the dining chamber, filling the air with the fragrance of myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus blossoms. Guests reclined on couches draped in linen, surrounded by golden vessels, inlaid furniture, and the glow of polished bronze lamps. Musicians played softly in the background, and servants moved silently, trained to anticipate needs without interrupting the flow of conversation. Every detail was calculated to immerse the guest in an atmosphere of luxury and controlled intimacy. When Julius Caesar dined with Cleopatra in 48 BCE, the political stakes were immense. Egypt was in the midst of a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Caesar's presence in Alexandria offered her an opportunity to secure her throne with Rome's backing. by receiving him in the Ptolemaic palace and hosting a banquet on her terms. Cleopatra created a setting where she controlled the narrative. The exotic dishes and intoxicating scents reinforced her identity as a sovereign whose resources and refinement surpassed even Rome's elite. Mark Antony's first banquet with Cleopatra in 41 BCE in the city of Tarsus became legendary. According to Plutarch, she arrived on a gilded barge with purple sails, its air perfumed by burning incense, and invited Antony to dine aboard. The meal was a display of opulence: golden cups, dishes of silver, rare wines, and platters of game, fish, and sweetmeats. The abundance and variety sent a clear political message. Egypt was a land of inexhaustible wealth, and Cleopatra its living embodiment. The choice of foods and fragrances at these meals was not arbitrary. Ancient physicians and philosophers believed that certain flavors could influence mood and perception. Spices with warming properties, ginger, cinnamon, pepper, were thought to quicken the blood and stimulate desire. Sweet, rich foods like honey and dates were linked to vitality and pleasure. Wines infused with herbs could relax inhibitions and encourage openness in conversation. By weaving these elements into her banquets, Cleopatra created an environment in which her guests were physically and psychologically primed to respond favorably to her proposals. These banquets were also displays of cultural fluency. Cleopatra could present a menu that blended Greek, Egyptian, and Roman culinary traditions, reflecting her role as a mediator between worlds. To Caesar, she offered familiarity in the form of garum-seasoned dishes and Italian wines. To Antony, she matched Roman luxury with Egyptian spectacle, presenting rare local delicacies that no Roman host could match. By tailoring the experience to each guest's tastes and expectations, she reinforced personal bonds that extended into political alliance. Psychological warfare played its part. Excessive generosity in hospitality could create a sense of obligation. In the guest a phenomenon well understood in ancient diplomacy. To accept Cleopatra's food and drink was to acknowledge her status as a benefactor, a relationship that in many cultures carried implicit debts. The Roman tradition of amicitia, system of mutual obligations, among elitesmen, that such gestures could translate into political loyalty. The feasts were also occasions for subtle assertion of dominance. In the arrangement of the couches, the choice of drinking vessels, and the sequence of dishes, Cleopatra could remind her guest of her control over the setting. Servants attended to her first. Conversations revolved around her remarks, and even the pacing of the courses was under her command. To a Roman general accustomed to giving orders, such subtle shifts in power dynamics could be disorienting, softening resistance without overt confrontation. In both the Caesar and Antony episodes, the banquets were preludes to deeper political engagement. With Caesar, the alliance forged in Alexandria led to his military support against her brother's forces, restoring her to the throne. With Antony, the bond established at Tarsus grew into a partnership that would shape the Eastern Mediterranean for a decade, culminating in shared military campaigns and the donations of Alexandria. In both cases, the sensory theatre of the banquet was a first act in a larger drama of political maneuvering. Cleopatra's mastery of the banquet as a political tool reflected the broader traditions of the Hellenistic courts, where rulers used spectacle to project power and secure alliances. Yet her execution was distinct in its fusion of Egyptian ritual symbolism, Greek sophistication, and Roman appetite for luxury. Food, scent, and ceremony were deployed not merely for indulgence, but as instruments of persuasion. For her, the banquet table was a battlefield of a different kind, one where influence was won not with swords or legions, but with the slow intoxication of the senses. Every taste, every aroma, every shimmering vessel contributed to the same purpose, to bind her guests to her cause before they even realized they had agreed to it. In the final hours before meeting a Roman ruler, Cleopatra's preparations were not acts of vanity, they were the execution of a carefully rehearsed state ritual. Every movement, every choice of scent, color, and texture had a political purpose. By the time she appeared, she would not merely be a monarch, she would be a living embodiment of Egypt's divine order. The process began with the bath. Within the palace in Alexandria, a chamber was set aside for her private cleansing. Attendants poured milk, usually from donkeys, sometimes from camels, some to a large alabaster basin. If fresh, it was warmed and mixed with honey and crushed rose petals. If soured, its lactic acid served to soften and brighten the skin. Servants monitored the temperature constantly, adding more heated milk or fragrant infusions of cinnamon and myrrh. This was not a hurried process. Immersion could last an hour, the queen's skin absorbing the oils and the faint scent that would linger. Beneath her perfumes, once bathed, the skin was treated with unguents. These were prepared in the palace's own laboratories, where perfumers and alchemists worked under strict supervision. Balanos, oil pressed from the desert date tree, served as the base. To it were added myrrh for its resinous depth, cassia for warmth, and lotus for sweetness. Some blends were reserved for public appearances, their recipes guarded like state secrets. These unguents did more than moisturize, they were layered to create a sensory memory. Anyone who encountered Cleopatra would associate her presence with that distinctive fragrance. Next came treatments for the face. Masks of ground liver mixed with honey, or red ochre blended with water and gum, were applied to create a faint flush of color. Around the eyes, kohl made from galena was carefully drawn to extend in precise lines toward the temples, evoking the sacred eye of Horus. Malachite, ground into a fine green powder, could be added to the lower lids for ceremonial emphasis. These were not random flourishes. Each pigment and line carried symbolic weight, linking the queen to deities such as Hathor and Isis. Lips and cheeks received color from mineral and plant sources. Cinnabar, though toxic by modern understanding, provided a vivid and lasting red, sometimes softened by mixing it with beeswax or gum. The result was a face that appeared alive with vitality under lamplight, its colors resisting the fading effect of the dim, smoky interiors where most royal encounters took place. Attire was chosen with the same precision as the cosmetics. For a Roman audience, Cleopatra might select garments that blended Egyptian and Hellenistic styles, a finely pleated linen gown clasped with gold, over which she could drape a silk himation imported from the East. Colors were symbolic: white for purity, gold for divinity, purple for sovereignty. Jewelry was heavy with meaning. Collars of gold and faience, set with turquoise and lapis, stones associated with protection and eternity. Each piece was positioned to catch the light at a specific moment in her approach. Servants were central to this transformation. Personal attendants handled her clothing and cosmetics, while perfumers oversaw the oils. The alchemists and herbalists ensured the freshness of ingredients, preparing them on the day of the meeting. Palace officials coordinated the logistics, timing, lighting, and the arrangement of the reception space so that Cleopatra's entrance would unfold exactly as intended. This entrance was not casual. It was staged with the precision of a religious procession. If the meeting took place in Alexandria, the chosen hall would be cooled with palm fronds and perfumed with incense before the guest arrived. If aboard her barge, as with her meeting with Mark Antony at Tarsus in 41 BCE, sails would be drenched in scent so that the air carried her presence, even before she was visible. The moment of approach was the culmination of the ritual. Cleopatra understood the Roman emphasis on spectacle and the psychological effect of anticipation. She would enter at a pace calculated to allow every detail to be absorbed: the drape of the garment, the gleam of gold, the framing of her eyes, and the unmistakable fragrance that surrounded her. Lighting played a role. In a hall lit by oil lamps, shadows emphasized the contours of her face and the brightness of her eyes. By the time she reached speaking distance, the sensory experience was complete. The guest had seen the gleam of alabaster skin, caught the complex scent of her perfumes, heard the faint rustle of her garments, and felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The transformation from mortal ruler to living goddess was total, and it had been accomplished without a single word spoken. In Egyptian political culture, the ruler was not merely a sovereign, but the earthly manifestation of divine power. This belief carried over into Ptolemaic practice, though adapted to the Hellenistic world's expectations. Cleopatra's ritual was, in effect, a fusion of these traditions. It drew on the Egyptian concept of hekamagic that bound the spiritual and physical worlds, while also satisfying the Greek and Roman appreciation for cultivated beauty and grandeur. For the Romans she dealt with, the impression was unforgettable. Julius Caesar first encountered her in this heightened state during her return to power in 48 BCE. Mark Antony experienced it on the Cydnus River when she arrived under full sail, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids, her own appearance framed as that of Aphrodite or Isis. Both men, powerful and accustomed to commanding deference, found themselves meeting a woman who could match their presence in scale and in command of the senses. The ritual before the storm was not a private indulgence. It was political armament. In a world where diplomacy relied on personal encounters, the ability to control every aspect of one's image was a form of power. Cleopatra's mastery of this process allowed her to engage Rome's most formidable leaders on terms that were, at least in the opening moments, entirely her own. When the meeting began, she was not simply Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic line. She was Egypt, its wealth, its ancient authority, its gods, and its destiny made flesh. And in the minds of those she sought to influence, the memory of that transformation would endure long after the words of negotiation had faded. For Cleopatra VII, seduction was never confined to private chambers. It was a public act, a political instrument, and a calculated extension of her authority as Egypt's last reigning monarch. The rituals that Roman writers later cast as vanity milk baths, elaborate perfumes, dangerous cosmetics were, in reality, part of a coherent strategy of statecraft. In a Mediterranean world where power often hinged on personal alliances, the queen's control over her image was as important as the soldiers in her garrisons or the grain in her storehouses. When Cleopatra assumed the throne in 51 BCE, Egypt's political position was precarious. The Ptolemaic dynasty had been weakened by years of internal strife and dependency on Roman military and financial support. Rome was no longer a distant alloyant, was an intrusive power, its generals and politicians competing for influence over Egypt's wealth. Cleopatra understood that survival required more than diplomacy in the traditional sense. It required winning over the men who controlled the republic's armies and treasuries. Her first and most famous political alliance was with Julius Caesar in 48 BCE. Their meeting, often dramatized in later accounts, was the result of necessity. She was embroiled in a civil war against her brother Ptolemy XIII, who held the capital with the support of key court factions. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria to arbitrate the conflict presented a rare opportunity. To secure his favor, Cleopatra had to stand out, not simply as a petitioner, but as a sovereign whose presence demanded respect. The methods she employed were steeped in centuries of Egyptian royal tradition, adapted to appeal to Roman sensibilities. Appearances were staged with the precision of temple ceremonies. Baths, perfumes, cosmetics, attire, and entrance rituals worked together to construct an image of authority wrapped in allure. When Caesar backed her claim to the throne and fought alongside her against Ptolemy's forces, it was a victory for Egypt's autonomy, but one achieved as much through personal influence as through battlefield strategy after Caesar's assassination. In 44 BCE, Cleopatra turned her attention to Mark Antony, one of the three men who now ruled the Roman world. Their meeting in 41 BCE at Tarsus is among the most studied episodes of political theatre in antiquity. Sailing up the Cydnus River on a gilded barge with purple sails and perfumed air, Cleopatra transformed her arrival into a living tableau of Aphrodite meeting Dionysus. The spectacle played directly into Antony's self-image as a new Hercules and benefactor of the East. It was a deliberate seduction not of a man alone, but of a political partner whose support could secure Egypt's borders and restore Ptolemaic influence in the eastern Mediterranean. From the Roman perspective, Cleopatra's tactics inspired both fascination and revulsion. Admirers spoke of her multilingual eloquence, wit, and command of conversation. Critics, particularly those aligned with her enemy Octavian, portrayed her as a manipulative foreign queen whose charms ensnared otherwise virtuous Roman leaders. The propaganda war intensified in the lead-up to the final conflict between Octavian and the Antony-Cleopatra alliance. Octavian's supporters depicted Antony as a man who had abandoned Roman discipline under the influence of an Eastern temptress, a narrative that helped justify the declaration of war against her in 32 BCE. This duality, admiration for her brilliance and condemnation of her influence, was central to how Cleopatra was remembered in Roman sources. Plutarch, writing a century later, observed that her allure lay less in conventional beauty than in the total effect of her personality, voice, and presence. Cassius Dio echoed this, describing her as a woman of surpassing beauty whose conversation could subjugate everyone. Yet both acknowledged that her appeal was as much intellectual and performative as physical. The effectiveness of her strategy can be measured in political outcomes. Her relationship with Caesar restored her to the throne and secured the survival of her son Caesarion as heir. Her alliance with Antony extended Egyptian influence over parts of Syria, Cilicia, and Cyprus through the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE for nearly a decade. This partnership challenged Rome's dominance in the eastern provinces. Without these personal alliances, Egypt's fall to Roman annexation would likely have come years earlier, but the very tools that preserved her reign also shaped the manner of its downfall. In Roman political culture, male leaders could forge alliances through marriage, adoption, and patronage without compromising their image. A woman who sought similar influence, especially over Roman men, was viewed with suspicion, particularly if she was a foreign monarch. By tying her political fortunes so closely to Antony, Cleopatra made herself inseparable from his fate. When Antony's forces were defeated at Actium in 31 BCE, Egypt's independence was effectively lost. The question of her physical beauty remains a subject of debate among historians and archaeologists. Ancient coins and busts from her reign show a strong, prominent nose, a determined jaw, and features that do not match the later idealized portraits of her as a flawless beauty. These images suggest that her power to captivate lay not in extraordinary physical perfection, but in the construction of an image that transcended such measures. Every element of her appearance, from the kohl-lined eyes to the choice of robe, was part of a system designed to project vitality, wealth, and divine authority. Roman accounts that dwelt on the strangeness or even repulsiveness of some of her beauty rituals: bathing in sour milk, using animal blood, applying toxic minerals. Fun did so to undermine her. Yet these practices, however foreign to Roman tastes, had deep cultural and symbolic significance in Egypt. They linked the queen to the gods, to the cycles of fertility and renewal, and to the protection of the state. The suggestion that her allure was an illusion crafted from such rituals was meant as an insult in Roman propaganda. But in practice, illusion was a recognized and legitimate tool of statecraft in the Hellenistic world to her subjects. Cleopatra's presentation was not deceit, it was fulfillment of a royal duty. The Ptolemaic monarch was expected to appear as a divine being, a guarantor of the Nile's fertility and the kingdom's prosperity. The ruler's image was part of the machinery of governance, no less important than the scribes who managed taxation or the generals who defended the borders. In that sense, Cleopatra's beauty rituals were acts of governance, intended to reinforce her legitimacy at home and her influence abroad. The blending of seduction and politics was not unique to Cleopatra, but she practiced it with a precision and scale unmatched by her contemporaries. Her reign demonstrated that in the ancient world, where alliances were forged face to face and reputations could determine the fate of nations, control over the senses could be as decisive as control over armies. In the end, her strategy delayed Egypt's fall for nearly 2 decades in an era when Rome was steadily absorbing the last independent kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. That delay allowed her to secure her legacy, not merely as the last Ptolemaic ruler, but as a political figure whose mastery of image and influence altered the course of history. Whether her beauty was real in the physical sense or largely the product of ritual, symbolism, and performance is ultimately secondary. What mattered was that it worked, that Caesar, Antony, and countless others who encountered her left convinced they had been in the presence of something extraordinary. In that conviction lay her true power, and it was wielded with the deliberate precision of a ruler who understood that in her time, seduction could be the highest form of statecraft.